The marble floors of the National Museum of Fine Arts echoed softly beneath Karoline Leavitt's heels as she stepped inside, her presence composed, polished, and unmistakably confident. She was invited to speak on art and freedom of expression in America, a topic she carried not only in words but in her very posture. Dressed in a navy blue blazer with a subtle American flag pin at the lapel, Karoline projected dignity and quiet strength. Her speech, carefully prepared, was tucked inside a slim leather folder she carried in one hand. In the other, she clutched a sense of calm conviction. At just 27, she was the youngest White House press secretary in history. But in this moment, she wasn't a title. She was a voice. At the far end of the hall, Eleanor Watts, the museum's longtime curator, stiffened at the sight of her. Eleanor, a proud liberal and vocal critic of conservative politics, recognized Karoline instantly. Her expression shifted from polite surprise to thinly veiled disdain. To Eleanor, Karoline represented everything she'd spent decades opposing. Without public announcement or private courtesy, Eleanor quietly instructed her team to cancel Karoline's keynote, citing program restructuring. No further explanation, no discussion, just a silent erasure. Karoline was handed a new directive. Please stay as an attending guest. The change wasn't made public, but the energy in the room shifted. A hush fell as word began to spread behind closed doors. The air grew thick with tension, not from what was said, but from what was denied. Karoline didn't react yet. She simply nodded, thanked the staff, and took a front-row seat. But in her eyes something flickered, not outrage, not fear, but calculation. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but it was already on the radar. Karoline sat in the front row of the grand hall, surrounded by marble columns and dimmed golden lighting, her folder still resting quietly on her lap. The room buzzed with whispers and rustling programs. She leaned gently toward a staff member at the side, her tone polite yet curious. "Excuse me," she said, tilting her head. "Do you know what time I'm scheduled to speak?" The staff member hesitated, glanced nervously toward the back of the room, then disappeared through a side door. A moment later, Eleanor Watts appeared, shoulders square, expression fixed in a tight, rehearsed smile. She approached with the same poise one might use to greet an unwelcome guest at a black-tie dinner. "There's been a change," Eleanor said, her voice smooth but cold. "We've restructured the program. Your remarks are no longer required." Karoline's brow lifted ever so slightly. "May I ask why?" Eleanor didn't blink. "We decided your message no longer aligns with the tone we're trying to set today. The museum has to remain a neutral space. We don't want to inject politics into art." Karoline studied her for a quiet beat. "I was asked here to speak about artistic freedom and the First Amendment. That's not politics. That's the Constitution." Eleanor's expression didn't change. "It's still not appropriate today." Standing a few feet behind Eleanor was Sophia Lane, a young assistant curator barely out of grad school. She looked visibly uncomfortable, her eyes darting between the two women. It was clear from her fidgeting hands and flushed cheeks that this decision wasn't discussed ahead of time. Karoline noticed and filed it away. Instead of arguing, Karoline offered a simple nod, her demeanor graceful, but her silence heavy. She reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and typed a brief message with steady hands. "Nathan. They just canceled my speech. No reason, no warning. Post the clip now. Use hashtag #silenced4politics. She hit send. From the outside, nothing had changed. Karoline remained seated, elegant and composed. But the ripple had been released. Within minutes, Nathan Moore, her communications advisor, uploaded a 52-second pre-recorded video to X, formerly Twitter. It had been filmed just 2 days earlier at her D.C. office, a smart move in case of sabotage. The caption read, "Karoline Leavitt was just silenced at the National Museum of Fine Arts. Her speech on freedom of expression was canceled. 20 minutes before showtime. Watch what they didn't want you to hear. Silence. For politics. Hashtag free speech. Matters. The video began with Karoline in her office standing in front of an American flag and a shelf lined with history books. Her tone was respectful but unyielding. Freedom of expression is not a luxury for the politically correct. It's a right. Art is not owned by any ideology. It is a mirror, a memory, a movement. And when we start censoring voices because of political fear, we don't protect the arts, we destroy their purpose. As the video spread across social media like wildfire, reactions poured in. Ex-users shared it with tags like outrageous and let her speak. Conservative media accounts reposted it within minutes. Even a few liberal-leaning commentators chimed in, some with sympathy, others with skepticism. But the momentum was unmistakable. Back inside the museum, the energy had shifted. Attendees began checking their phones. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Is this the woman they canceled?" Another replied, "I just saw it on X. This is blowing up." Karoline sat still, her expression unreadable. But deep down she knew this moment was no longer contained within those walls. It had just gone national. Sophia Lane quietly approached her during the intermission, her voice low and apologetic. "Miss Leavitt, I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she whispered. "We didn't know. The decision was made last minute. I only found out 20 minutes ago." Karoline smiled softly. "It's all right, Sophia. I don't hold it against you." Sophia hesitated, then added, "Your video, it's everywhere already." Karoline nodded once. "Good. Let the people decide what's appropriate." Meanwhile, Eleanor stood in the hallway near the entrance, speaking in hushed tones with two board members. Her jaw tightened with every buzz of her phone, each alert signaling a growing storm she could no longer control. Her attempt to silence Karoline had backfired spectacularly. Within the hour, the video had over 850,000 views, and hashtag silence for politics was trending at number 3 in the country. Fox News aired a short segment within the hour. Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history, was reportedly barred from speaking at a major art institution today. Her prepared remarks, which emphasized freedom of expression, are now going viral. Back at the museum, Karoline finally stood up. Not with rage, not with grand theatrics. She simply gathered her folder, tucked her phone back in her purse, and walked quietly toward the exit. As she passed by Eleanor, she stopped briefly and said without venom, "You didn't cancel a speech today. You created a movement." Then she walked out, heels clicking softly against the stone floor, the sound echoing like a drumbeat of quiet defiance. By the time she reached the sidewalk, Nathan had already texted 2.1 million views. "Jesse Waters wants you on tonight. You're trending." Karoline replied, "I'll be ready." The night wasn't over. It had only just begun. Karoline didn't storm out of the National Museum of Fine Arts. She didn't raise her voice or make a scene. Instead, she remained seated in the same velvet-covered chair she'd quietly occupied at the beginning of the evening, her program folded neatly in her lap. The air around her buzzed with tension, but she exuded a stillness that felt almost defiant. Just 10 minutes earlier, she'd been told her speech was canceled. No explanation that held water. No apology. Just a cold, bureaucratic dismissal from Eleanor Watts, the museum's chief curator, a woman who had clearly allowed politics to overpower principle. And now that same woman stood at the podium, speaking with animated gestures about how art must be a tool for resistance and institutions have a duty to challenge oppressive narratives. Karoline's eyes didn't roll, though many in the crowd might have forgiven her if they had. Instead, she offered a faint, knowing smile, one that said, "You're proving my point better than I ever could." From a few rows back, a small group of young attendees watched her closely. They weren't critics or activists. They were law students from nearby Georgetown, bright, curious, and visibly uncomfortable with what had just happened. One of them, a tall student named Marcus Dunn, leaned forward and whispered to his friend, "That's Karoline Leavitt, the press secretary. Why on earth would they cancel her?" Another replied, "I follow her on X. She's trending right now. This is blowing up." As Eleanor wrapped up her speech with a carefully scripted call for diverse perspectives in art, the students could no longer sit still. They gathered their belongings and made their way down the side aisle toward Karoline. "Miss Leavitt," Marcus said politely, his voice low but urgent, "would you be willing to speak outside? Just something short. Our professor canceled class to bring us here. We want to hear what you had to say." Karoline paused, genuinely touched by the invitation. She studied the young faces before her, open, attentive, and most importantly, willing to listen. With a soft nod, she replied, "I'd be honored." The group led her toward the museum's west courtyard, a quiet, open-air plaza framed by sculptures and stone benches. A few curious attendees followed at a distance, then more. By the time Karoline stood beneath a marble arch near the garden's edge, nearly 70 people had gathered, students, visitors, even a few museum donors who had overheard whispers of what was happening. Someone pulled out a phone, then another. Live streams began. The artificial light from screens glowed in the twilight like fireflies. And then Karoline began to speak. "I was invited to speak today," she started, "about art and freedom. Instead, I became an example of what happens when freedom is filtered through ideology." Her voice was steady but warm. No script, no notes, just conviction. "In this very museum," she continued, gesturing softly, "we are surrounded by art created under conditions of repression, dissent, and courage. Some of it offends. Some of it inspires. But all of it exists because someone chose to express a truth that mattered to them." She paused, letting the words settle. "The First Amendment," she said, "isn't there to protect the popular or the palatable. It's there for the voices people try to silence." In Snyder v. Phelps, the Supreme Court upheld speech that many found deeply offensive, not because they agreed with it, but because they knew the alternative was worse. A world where the government decides what can and cannot be said. The crowd stood rapt. The wind stirred gently through the trees, but no one moved. "In America," Karoline said, "you don't have to agree with someone to let them speak. You just have to believe that the truth isn't something that needs protecting. It's something that needs airing." The applause was immediate, earnest, and unfiltered. In the museum's control room, a security guard watching the courtyard on surveillance monitors leaned toward his co-worker. "They're all outside now," he murmured. "She's speaking there." Back inside the hall, Eleanor noticed the emptying chairs. One by one, guests were slipping away, not out of disrespect, but curiosity. Her carefully curated program was unraveling in real time, undone not by protest, but by principle. Meanwhile, outside, Karoline's live stream had crossed 500,000 views in just 40 minutes. Clips circulated rapidly. One 14-second segment where she said freedom doesn't come from permission. It comes from courage was reshared by journalists, former politicians, and artists alike. Across the country, Americans tuned in. Some cheered, some debated. But no one could ignore the moment. Marcus stepped forward after her final words. "That was incredible," he said, beaming. "You just gave the most powerful lecture we've heard all semester." Karoline smiled, placing a hand briefly on his shoulder. "I didn't come here to fight," she said. "But sometimes silence is the most political act of all." As the sun dipped below the skyline, she thanked. The crowd shook hands and quietly left the plaza, her words echoing far beyond the courtyard walls. And while Eleanor stayed behind, fuming and increasingly isolated, Karoline's message had already leapt beyond the confines of one institution, into the heart of a nation hungry for courage, wrapped in calm, for truth, spoken with grace. As the sun faded behind the classical stone facade of the National Museum of Fine Arts, a quiet storm was brewing, not on stage, not in protest chants, but in the hearts of those who had watched what happened and knew something wasn't right. Miguel Torres, a 52-year-old security guard with salt and pepper hair and a watchful eye, stood silently by the exit as Karoline Leavitt wrapped up her impromptu courtyard speech. He had worked events at the museum for nearly 2 decades, gallery openings, donor galas, even presidential visits. But tonight felt different. He'd seen Karoline arrive with grace and respect, dressed professionally, carrying herself with dignity. He'd watched Eleanor Watts give the silent nod that led to Karoline being cut from the schedule. And he'd seen the crowd shift away from curated control and toward spontaneous truth. Miguel didn't consider himself a political man, but he knew decency when he saw it. That night, as he clocked out of his shift and returned to his modest home in Arlington, he logged into the museum's internal reporting system and submitted a rare written statement. The decision to cancel Ms. Leavitt's scheduled remarks appeared to be based not on logistics or timing, but political bias. It undermines the museum's stated mission to protect free expression in the arts. I believe this was wrong. Miguel Torres, Sr., Event Security. He didn't expect it to make a difference, but he had to say something. To stay silent now felt like complicity. Elsewhere in Washington, the ripple continued to spread. At a small dorm room on Howard University's campus, Jada Coleman, a junior studying art history and African American studies, sat on her bed scrolling through her phone. She had been at the event earlier with her professor. Like many students, she'd been skeptical of Karoline Leavitt's politics. But what she saw, how calmly Karoline responded to being silenced, struck her. She rewatched the live stream, especially the part where Karoline said, "In America, the right to speak freely is not granted by approval. It's granted by principle." Jada exhaled, stunned. That didn't sound like spin. That sounded like something her own grandparents' civil rights marchers in the 1960s might have said. Without overthinking, she tapped share on the clip, adding her own comment. "I don't agree with Trump, but I also don't agree with silencing someone because of their views. That's not the America I believe in." Hashtag let her speak. Art for all. She hit post and went back to her homework. By midnight, her post had over 42,000 likes and was being quoted by journalists and public figures alike. By 3 a.m., it had been featured on Fox News's digital feed, cited on The Hill, and retweeted by a surprising mix of voices, some conservative, some moderate, and even one liberal podcast host who wrote, "Agree with her or not, Karoline Leavitt gave a masterclass in grace under fire tonight." The hashtags hashtag let her speak and hashtag art for all began trending in the early hours of the morning. What began as a quiet injustice inside a museum had now become a cultural moment, a flashpoint in a divided America, where one young woman's refusal to retaliate had resonated across party lines. In a small kitchen in suburban Ohio, a retired Navy veteran named Tom Wainwright poured himself a cup of black coffee as his wife scrolled through headlines. "Tom," she said, turning the tablet screen toward him. "Look at this girl. You remember Karoline Leavitt?" He squinted at the image, then nodded. "White House press secretary. The young one. Tough as nails." His wife nodded. "They tried to cancel her speech at the National Museum. Told her to sit down. She didn't fight. She just walked outside and gave her talk to the students instead. Now the whole country's talking about it." Tom read in silence for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Sounds like someone we could have used in the Navy." She didn't take the bait. That sentiment, not taking the bait, spread like wildfire. In a world where outrage was often met with louder outrage, Karoline's restraint made her stand out. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't stormed off. She'd just told the truth, with clarity, conviction, and respect. And that's what made the moment so powerful. Back at the museum, Eleanor Watts sat at her mahogany desk, nervously refreshing her inbox. Messages were pouring in from donors, board members, and journalists. One email subject line read, "What happened to free expression at the museum?" Another said, "Why did you silence Karoline Leavitt?" Her assistant Sophia Lane stood by with her arms folded, visibly shaken. "I didn't know it would blow up like this," she whispered. Eleanor's jaw tightened. "We did what we had to do." Sophia hesitated. "Did we?" The question lingered like a draft through a closed window. Meanwhile, Karoline sat in a quiet corner of a Capitol Hill cafe with her team. Her social media coordinator, Nathan, grinned as he read the latest stats. "Ma'am," he said with astonishment, "that clip hit 1.4 million views just this morning, and over 70,000 comments. Most of them are positive, even from folks who say they disagree with your politics." Karoline nodded calmly, stirring her tea. "This was never about politics," she said. "It was about principle." Nathan looked up. "So what's next?" Karoline smiled softly. "Let them keep watching. We're not done yet." The lesson was clear. In a time when division dominates, dignity still matters. And sometimes the strongest voice in the room isn't the one yelling. It's the one speaking with calm purpose, refusing to be silenced. By dawn, the stately stone walls of the National Museum of Fine Arts no longer symbolized quiet reverence. They now felt like walls closing in. In an office lined with awards and archived exhibits, Eleanor Watts sat upright in her leather chair, staring at the blinking red light on her landline. She had already let it go to voicemail 3 times, but now it rang again. She had no choice but to answer. Eleanor Watts speaking. A measured male voice crackled through the speaker. It was Harold McIntyre, chairman of the museum's board of trustees. Calm, but unmistakably stern. "Eleanor, can you explain why a scheduled guest speaker who appeared on our printed program no less was silenced without notice? And why the media is now calling this a political blacklisting?" Eleanor took a breath. There were concerns. Security concerns. And frankly, some in the audience expressed discomfort. "Who exactly expressed discomfort?" McIntyre pressed. "Can you provide names?" There was a pause. Eleanor's voice faltered. I don't have specifics at this moment. It was communicated to me informally just minutes before the event." The silence on the other end spoke volumes. "We need an internal report by end of day," McIntyre said. "And Eleanor, keep in mind this is no longer an internal matter. CNN called us twice this morning, and Fox News is already spinning it." As the line clicked dead, Eleanor leaned back, her heart pounding. For the first time in her long career, she felt like she was the exhibit on full display under unforgiving light. In the hallway outside her office, Sophia Lane paced nervously, a tablet clutched in her hand. She had overheard enough. Quietly, she knocked. "Eleanor," she said gently, cracking the door. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, her tone sharper than intended. Sophia hesitated, then stepped in. "It's spreading. The press is here. Washington Post, Politico, even NPR. They're asking if the museum officially censored a speaker for political reasons." Eleanor clenched her jaw. "Tell them we're reviewing the matter." Sophia remained still. "Eleanor, they're not waiting for statements. The students are already giving interviews. Clips of Karoline's speech in the courtyard have passed 2 million views. The hashtags, #Let Her Speak, and Art for All, they're trending in over 20 states. For a moment, Eleanor didn't respond. Then she whispered almost to herself, this was supposed to be a quiet correction, not a national flashpoint. But outside her walls, the world had already chosen a narrative. In the rotunda, visitors moved through the marble halls, but many weren't studying the paintings. They were filming snapping photos of the very stage where Karoline had been scheduled to speak. A plaque with her name still hung on the podium, an ironic artifact of what should have been. A woman in a red scarf turned to her husband. She came here to talk about freedom in art, and they shut her down. Ironic, isn't it? The man replied, shaking his head. It's like trying to teach liberty by locking the doors. Back in her office, Eleanor opened her laptop and began typing the internal report. Each word felt heavier than the last. Due to concerns regarding public safety and potential audience disruption, the scheduled remarks of Ms. Karoline Leavitt were removed from the program. The decision was made swiftly and in good faith to preserve the integrity of the event. She stared at the blinking cursor. Even to herself it sounded hollow. Sophia watched her from the doorway. After a moment she stepped inside, closed the door, gently, and sat down. "Eleanor," she said softly, "I know you didn't mean for this to explode, but pretending it didn't happen or blaming unnamed security concerns it won't hold. People can see right through it." Eleanor looked up, her composure thinning. "I didn't think she would make a scene." "She didn't," Sophia said. "And that's the problem. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't storm out. She spoke with dignity, and the world noticed." Eleanor looked away, shame creeping in despite herself. Sophia continued, "I think we need to acknowledge it. Publicly. Apologize not for policy, but for handling it poorly. The museum stands for freedom of expression. That's the banner above our front doors." Eleanor stayed quiet. Outside, the sound of more reporters arriving echoed through the atrium. Elsewhere in the city, Karoline Leavitt sat with Nathan in a quiet Capitol Hill office. She was scanning her phone, watching the reaction unfold in real time. "Dozens of students reposted your quote," Nathan said. "Even people who don't like Trump are saying you handled it better than most politicians would." Karoline remained thoughtful, her expression calm. "I'm not trying to convert people," she said. "I just want Americans, especially young ones, to see that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard." Nathan nodded, then looked up from his screen. "You're getting calls from journalists, late-night hosts, even a few museum donors who want to talk. Do you want me to arrange interviews?" Karoline looked out the window. "No, not yet. Let them come to their own conclusions first." Across the country, the divide between personal conviction and institutional pressure had rarely been clearer. One woman's silence had become louder than the podium she'd been denied. And now, inside the marble halls of the very institution that tried to quiet her, a reckoning had begun. The museum, long considered a fortress of cultural authority, now found itself at a crossroads, one defined not by exhibits, but by accountability. And Eleanor Watts, she wasn't just drafting a report. She was writing her own place in history, one paragraph at a time. By Thursday afternoon, the National Museum of Fine Arts was no longer a place of quiet contemplation. Outside its grand columns, cameras flashed, reporters jostled for space, and the low hum of expectation spread across Constitution Avenue like thunderclouds before a storm. Inside, under the museum's soaring rotunda, Eleanor Watts stood behind a modest podium. Her usual elegance remained: gray blazer, crisp blouse, pearl earrings. But something had changed. Her voice, once so assertive and unyielding, now carried the trembling undertone of a woman facing the consequences of her own conviction. She looked out at the crowd, dozens of journalists, museum board members, students, and even a few staffers who had once silently supported her decisions. The same walls that had once amplified her authority now felt like they were closing in. She began slowly, her voice steady, but heavy with emotion. "I want to thank you all for coming," she said, her fingers gently gripping the edge of the podium. "And I want to speak today not as a curator or as the director of this institution, but as a human being who made a mistake." Gasps didn't echo, but the air changed. She took a breath. "5 days ago, I made the decision to cancel Karoline Leavitt's scheduled remarks. I justified it in the moment with concerns about controversy, potential disruption, optics. But the truth is, none of those things were valid reasons. Her throat caught. I let my personal views cloud my professional judgment. And that is unacceptable. There was a silence so complete you could hear a reporter's pen slip from a notepad and hit the marble floor. Eleanor's gaze lowered, her voice softened. I've spent my life advocating for art as a tool of free expression, and yet I denied that very freedom to someone whose views I disagreed with. I was wrong. I apologize to Ms. Leavitt, and to every American who believes in the First Amendment. This museum failed to uphold its values, but I hope today marks a step toward repairing that failure. A murmur of surprise swept the room, not because the apology came, but because it came so plainly, so unguardedly. There were no spin doctors behind Eleanor now, just a woman facing her mistake under the scrutiny of a nation. As the press conference concluded, camera crews scrambled to broadcast the footage across networks. Within 30 minutes, the full clip had landed on every major news outlet, and more importantly on X, where it instantly went viral. At the same time across town, Karoline sat at her White House office desk, sipping coffee, reviewing reports about art censorship, museum funding, and the wave of public responses to her story. When her assistant Sarah rushed in holding a tablet, Karoline raised an eyebrow. "She did it," Sarah said breathlessly. "Eleanor just admitted everything. Full apology. It's already trending." Karoline leaned forward, watching the clip in full. She didn't smile. She didn't scoff. Instead, she paused the video just after Eleanor bowed her head and whispered, "I was wrong." There was a long moment of quiet in the office. Then Karoline reached for her phone and opened X. She posted the clip of Eleanor's speech with a caption that read, simply, "Freedom of expression shouldn't depend on your political party. I accept her apology. Karoline Leavitt, Art for All. Let her speak." Within minutes, the post exploded. Comments poured in from across the political spectrum, some praising Eleanor's humility, others commending Karoline for her grace. Even critics who disagreed with Karoline's politics admitted, this is what real leadership looks like. CNN called it a rare moment of public accountability. Fox News dubbed it a conservative win for free speech. And The Atlantic wrote, for once, an argument ended not in rage but in responsibility. But the moment wasn't just about two women on opposite ends of the political aisle. It was about everyone watching. Jada Coleman, the student who had shared Karoline's courtyard speech, went live on her campus Instagram saying, "This has been a masterclass in how to disagree with dignity." Eleanor admitted her mistake. Karoline didn't mock her. Maybe this country still has hope. Miguel Torres, the museum security guard who had filed the initial whistleblower report, quietly told a colleague in the break room, "I've worked here 15 years. Never thought I'd see a director say, 'I was wrong,' on camera." Respect. The hashtag let her speak trended again, this time not with outrage but with a strange blend of hope and reflection. Even Sophia Lane, the young assistant who had once been torn between silence and truth, posted a photo of the museum entrance with the caption, "Art should challenge, not silence." I'm proud we're learning that again. And what about Eleanor? After the press conference, she didn't linger. She declined interviews and avoided statements. Instead, she stepped out a side door of the museum into the afternoon light, accompanied by no one. But the look on her face, not defeated, humbled, resolved. She walked 3 blocks alone before finding a bench near the reflecting pool. Tourists wandered by. Ducks glided across the water. She sat with her thoughts, remembering the ideals that once drove her career. Then she pulled out her phone, and for the first time in days, she opened Karoline's feed. She saw the repost of her apology. She read the caption, Freedom of expression shouldn't depend on your political party. Her lips trembled not with shame this time, but with something she hadn't felt in years. A kind of gratitude. Back at the White House, Karoline finished reading the final draft of an op-ed for the next morning's edition of the Washington Times. Its title, When Apologies Matter, Why Grace Can Be Louder Than Outrage. She closed her laptop, leaned back in her chair, and let the weight of the week settle in. Not every battle had to end with broken glass and burned bridges. Sometimes the quietest victories changed the most hearts. As the sun dipped behind the Lincoln Memorial, casting long golden shadows across the city, two women once locked in an ideological standoff had chosen something rare in today's world: understanding. And as millions of Americans watched it unfold, many felt something stirring they hadn't in a long time: hope. By the next morning, the stately marble halls of the National Museum of Fine Arts didn't echo with quiet footsteps or the murmur of tour guides. Instead, they buzzed with a word that hadn't been spoken there in decades: accountability. The museum's board of trustees, a group not known for swift decisions, met in emergency session behind closed doors. The room was thick with tension: legal counsel present, press outside, and the nation watching. The outcome stunning. Eleanor Watts, once considered untouchable in elite art circles, was officially suspended pending a full independent investigation into political bias, procedural misconduct, and suppression of free speech. The announcement sent a ripple across the cultural landscape. News outlets from Fox News to NPR broke the story within minutes. Even international headlines caught fire: U.S. Museum in crisis over censorship accusation. But the real surprise came just an hour later. In a statement posted to the museum's official website and immediately shared across X and major networks, the institution made a move no one expected. One, the board has decided to restructure the upcoming program, Expression Without Borders. We are proud to announce that the revised opening event will be led by White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, who will deliver a keynote address on the enduring value of free speech in the American tradition. The words were formal, measured, but the implication was seismic. They weren't just trying to clean up the mess. They were giving Karoline center stage. Within 12 hours, the announcement had garnered over 6 million views, with hashtags like #LetHerSpeak, #Karoline Returns, and #Freedom first trending in every major U.S. city. It wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. CNN anchors admitted, "This story has turned the museum world upside down." The Wall Street Journal called it a case study in the costs of ideological overreach. Even the New York Times, typically skeptical of Karoline's politics, conceded in a headline: "From silence to spotlight. A lesson in free expression." But Karoline, she didn't gloat. She didn't post a viral video or take a victory lap. She stayed calm, collected, poised. That night she appeared on a nationally televised interview with veteran journalist Tom Hawthorne sitting across from him in a simple gray blazer, her hands folded gently in her lap. "Miss Leavitt," Tom began, "many people see what happened to you at the museum as politically motivated. Now that they've invited you back, some are calling this a public relations stunt. How do you respond?" Karoline's eyes didn't flinch. Her voice remained steady, deliberate. "I'm not interested in punishing anyone," she said. "I'm interested in principle. I accepted the invitation because the American people deserve to hear that free expression isn't reserved for one political side. It belongs to all of us." Tom leaned forward, nodding. "You've been called the silent anchor in this controversy. You never raised your voice. You never lashed out. And yet, you turned the tide." Karoline gave a small smile. "Sometimes the loudest message," she said, "is delivered in quiet conviction." That quote alone made its way into editorials, classrooms, and Sunday sermons across the country. And at the museum, the change was just beginning. The event, now rescheduled under the renewed title Expression Without Borders, Voices of the 21st Century, was suddenly the most anticipated cultural gathering in Washington, D.C. Reporters lined up. University groups secured blocks of seats. Veterans, teachers, young professionals, and retirees filled the guest list. And Karoline. She was announced as the opening keynote speaker. Her image, calm, centered professional, was now featured on the museum's website and promotional materials. The same museum that had once tried to erase her had now made her the symbol of reform. Inside the institution, changes were swift. A new review board was created to monitor event approvals. Political neutrality guidelines were rewritten. Staff were enrolled in constitutional literacy training, including First Amendment protections in cultural spaces. But it wasn't just policy shifts. The public mood had changed. In cities like Des Moines and Chattanooga, local artists began organizing pop-up exhibits under the banner #ArtForAll. College students hosted campus panels titled, "When Institutions Get It Wrong." Retirees in Florida wrote letters to local newspapers praising Karoline for showing what it means to be an American firm, fair and faithful to the Constitution. Even Karoline's political opponents, though hesitant, were forced to acknowledge her quiet strength. Senator Linda Mendez Dor posted on X, "We may disagree politically, but Karoline Leavitt's defense of free speech reminds us why the Constitution matters." Back at the White House, Sarah burst into Karoline's office with a stack of clippings. "You've just been profiled in the Atlantic Time and Real Clear Politics all in the same day." Karoline glanced up with that signature serene expression. "Did they mention the museum's changes?" Front and center. Sarah grinned. "You're being credited for inspiring institutional reform." Karoline leaned back slightly in her chair. She wasn't in it for the spotlight, but she knew the spotlight was now inescapable. She opened her laptop and began drafting her speech for the museum's event. The title, "The Frame is the Freedom Why True Art Demands True Speech." She paused, thinking of the millions who had tuned in not just to watch, but to feel seen, to feel like they too could speak again. The ripple that began inside a quiet gallery at the National Museum of Fine Arts didn't stop when Eleanor Watts stepped down, or when Karoline Leavitt returned to the podium. It became a wave, a national conversation that swept across institutions far beyond Washington, D.C. In the weeks that followed, museums from Boston to Los Angeles issued public statements, acknowledging the controversy and pledging to review their own speaker policies. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York launched a task force on viewpoint diversity. The Chicago Institute of Culture updated its mission statement to include a clause affirming the museum's commitment to First Amendment values. Even the Contemporary Arts Center in San Francisco, long known for progressive curation, held a roundtable titled "Bias or Balance: The Role of Politics in Modern Art Spaces." For the first time in decades, American cultural institutions were being asked not by lawmakers or donors, but by ordinary citizens to answer a simple, piercing question: are we truly open to ideas we don't agree with? That question echoed across op-eds, local town halls, radio programs, and church discussions. And surprisingly, it wasn't being asked in anger. It was being asked in sincerity, with a renewed hunger for fairness. One neutral news anchor on PBS stated it plainly: "The Karoline Leavitt incident forces all of us, left, right, and center, to reckon with the idea that freedom of expression must be protected, even when it makes us uncomfortable. Otherwise, we risk turning cultural spaces into echo chambers." But while the nation debated, Karoline chose not to fan the flames. She didn't go on a media tour or call for resignations. Instead, she recorded a short, heartfelt video from her White House office, one that would be shared millions of times over. In it, she sat beside an American flag wearing a simple navy blazer, her tone calm, thoughtful. "You don't have to agree with me," she began, looking directly into the camera. "In fact, I don't expect you to. That's what makes this country beautiful. But if I can be silenced, not because of what I said, but because of who I am, then that's not art. That's not dialogue. That's not democracy. That's censorship." She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle before adding, "And I won't stand for it. Not for myself, and not for anyone else." The video exploded across social media. Not because it was angry, not because it was flashy, but because it was real, grounded, American. Retirees from Michigan, Vietnam, veterans in Arizona, teachers in Kansas, and young professionals in Nashville all reposted the clip with personal reflections. A woman in Georgia commented, "I didn't vote for her boss, but she speaks the truth." A Vietnam vet wrote, "I served to protect the right to disagree. She reminded me of that." And slowly something rare began to happen in America. A moment of clarity, a shared realization that maybe, just maybe, free speech isn't a partisan issue. It's a foundational one. Behind the scenes, Karoline's quiet leadership continued. She worked with a bipartisan group of legal scholars to draft a framework for viewpoint neutrality in federally funded museums and cultural spaces. The proposal, backed by both Republicans and moderate Democrats, was being reviewed for possible inclusion in future federal grant guidelines. Yet Karoline never made it about herself. She stayed humble, often deflecting praise back toward the people who helped make the change possible. Miguel Torres, the security guard who spoke up. Jada Coleman, the student who shared her truth. Sophia Lane, the assistant curator who admitted the institution's failure. And everyday Americans who believed that truth shouldn't fear the microphone. During one appearance on 60 Minutes, Karoline was asked what she hoped people took away from the entire ordeal. She didn't pause. "I hope they remember that silence isn't always peace. Sometimes the most respectful thing we can do is to disagree openly with dignity. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand quietly and let the truth speak for itself." As she spoke, images flashed on screen, Karoline addressing the reopened art exhibit, school groups, touring galleries, artists hosting bipartisan dialogues. The change was real and ongoing. At the National Museum of Fine Arts, her keynote speech had been watched live by over 8.5 million viewers, and the replay surpassed 20 million views in just 3 days. But Karoline didn't measure success in numbers. She measured it in trust restored. One senior citizen from Omaha put it best in a letter to the editor. "I'm 78 years old. I've lived through the Cold War, Vietnam, Watergate, and 9/11, but watching Karoline Leavitt walk into that museum with grace and walk out with her principles intact, that gave me hope again. We're not too far gone." The museum, for its part, placed a permanent plaque in its atrium, honoring the exhibit that followed the controversy. It read, "In honor of all who believe that the freedom to speak is the foundation upon which all art and all truth must stand." The plaque didn't mention Karoline by name. It didn't have to. Everyone knew who had sparked the change. If you believe freedom of speech should never be censored based on who you are or what you believe, leave a comment below. Share this video with a friend who values truth over politics. Tell us, what does free speech mean to you in today's America? And don't forget to subscribe, because Karoline's journey isn't over. Not by a long shot. And in the next video, she takes on another challenge that may hit even closer to home. This isn't just a story. It's a call to remember who we are as Americans. And it starts with one voice. Yours.